You're listening to We're All Gonna Die Anyway with Jess Wiener. Don't worry. This is a joyful podcast about life, death, and everything in between. If it were not for this next guest, I don't know that I would even be having these conversations with you. And I know for sure I would have never launched a podcast called We're All Gonna Die Anyway. A couple of years ago, I took a family and friends trip for my birthday, and I brought along a book that somebody had recommended to me. It was called Let's Talk About Death, parentheses, Over Dinner. And I had just gone through my first really big loss from Myra, and I was working my way through the grief, and I read this book, and everything became very clear to me. That there was an opportunity, and not only that, a call to action to help normalize and talk about death in a way that I've never seen talked about before. And so it turns out that the writer of this book, the author of this book, Michael Hebb, also co-founded the movement called Death Over Dinner, which is basically this incredible global movement of dinners where people get together and with somewhat of a pre-guided or pre-suggested set of questions, you have conversations about death and dying and life and living with friends, with relatives, with strangers. Death over dinner has been done hundreds of thousands of times all over the world. And going to a death dinner party and having a death over dinner experience for me just was like a light bulb that went off. I realized that the things that we most worry about, the things that we most question, so many other people are feeling the same thing. We don't have proper channels of conversation, especially in the US, to talk about end of life, to talk about how we plan for a death if we can, what we'd like to see happen, how we'd like to feel. We don't talk about those things. It's sort of taboo. So when I was reading this book and researching Michael and getting this idea to have this conversation years ago called We're All Gonna Die Anyway, because it's true, we are, I knew I wanted to have him on the show. But I don't know Michael. And so I don't often get nervous when I reach out to people, but I was nervous in reaching out to him because I'd really fangirled over his work and really mostly admired the conversation that he was inserting into culture. And I cold emailed him. I think I might have reached out on Instagram first. Great account to follow, Death Over Dinner. And I pitched him. And he said yes. And so Michael Hebb is today's guest. And I'm so excited because Michael not only, this is just one of many kinds of culturally relevant, revolutionary conversations Michael has created and been a part of. He does a lot of stuff around food and technology, and everything has this humanitarian lens to it. And one of the things that he's launching now that I'm deeply excited about is an EOL community. He's a partner in a company called, in a company called Round Glass, which is a global well-being company, which just sounds amazing. And they do incredible things. And they launched the EOL community, and EOL stands for End of Life. And basically what it is this like incredible centralized marketplace where you can find service providers and information and resources all about navigating through end of life, be that hospice, be that funerals, be that will and estate planning, like all of the things that we have to pay attention to, hopefully sometimes before we get into the situation of leaving this earth. Michael and his partners at Round Glass and others have put together this incredible marketplace that didn't exist prior to this, where you can find the resources that you need. So if anybody is listening to this who has lost a loved one, obviously, all death feels unplanned, but let's just say you've lost a loved one tragically and suddenly. You have no idea what you get thrust into in the planning of taking care of those details. These are things that you don't want to think about when you're mourning and grieving the loss of somebody that you love. And all of those details, all of those ideas, all of those processes, there's support for that. And there are individuals who can help you move through that. I'm a proud part of the end of life community. I am in love with the concept that we are going to normalize again the process of dying, because it actually adds a great sense of urgency to our living and an opportunity to be in real connection with each other on these things that matter. And I can't think of anything that matters more. So in this convo today, Michael and I are going to talk about how he came to do this work. He has a really wonderful way that he talks about vulnerability in this interview and how he defines it and how he keeps himself with integrity around vulnerability, which is important in doing this work. But just like all of us, he comes to this through his own personal losses and through his own desire to see a world democratize and humanize death and dying and the end of life process. And I couldn't be more lit up for this conversation. I hope to have many more, to have him and others from the end of life world on this program. I'm so excited to introduce you to Michael Hebb. Let's dig in. So, Michael, when I put together in my mind sort of my ideal wish list of people I wanted to talk to when I started a program called We're All Gonna Die Anyway, you were absolutely top of the list because of your work in this space, which I want to talk about, but also I think it's in the delivery and the manner of which you've introduced normalizing this conversation for a lot of us. And so for me, I came to kind of wanting to talk about death and life and the being lit up for living as a part of this after a series of different losses that I had in my life a couple of years ago. But one in particular was really sparked, and I talk about this a lot on the show, about a client that I became friends with in the last 8 weeks of her life. And I'd never had, as an adult, it's always hard to make friends anyway, I think. And then you meet somebody who is exiting this earth and knew she was exiting this earth. And I didn't know her very well. Her name is Myra. I had had one meeting with her. Her husband called when she stopped her chemotherapy treatments and said she'd like to see you. I had never had dinner with her. I had never had a girls' night with her. I had never even had a real conversation outside of work with her. But she summoned me and I went, and what resulted was 8 weeks of building a relationship with somebody who I knew was not going to physically exist in this plane at the end. And that was in 2018 or 2017. She passed in the beginning of 2018. And it woke me up to this immediacy of my own living and wanting to, because I asked her some things that were really, that still stuck with me about what she thought about as she was facing her end of life moment. And she told me a couple of things, but one really stood out the most, which was she said, I spent too much time on toxic people and worrying about what people thought. The second was she missed the things her body could do naturally, just tasting a mango, walking in fresh air, and things that she wasn't able to physically accomplish. But the third one that really stuck with me was I wished I had spent more time on myself and doing less of the things that I thought I was supposed to be doing in the world. I'm going to miss the opportunity to learn some more things about who I am. And so the blessing of having that conversation, the harsh and stark reality of having that conversation, I think has been swirling with me for a while. And so I started this program to really honestly talk about a wide variety of things, but all of them anchored in the notion that we are all going to die. And what are we doing with the time that we have? And how are we destigmatizing that greatest fear for people? So I came to your work specifically with Death Over Dinner. That was what I did for my birthday the next year, was host a death dinner party for my friends. And it was on Dia de los Muertos. So we had a beautiful altar and arrangement to do that. So I gush and share this with you because it was like a real opening for me in my life that has now impacted my friends and my relationships and my work. And so a long, long way of saying thank you.
I'm speechless, which is a problem on a podcast. So I love that story, and it means a tremendous amount to me. That's why I do the work that I do.
Yeah.
And I even do it with the idea that it'll impact people that I'll never meet. And so it's great, but it's such an honor when I do meet people where the work and the gift that we've been giving has actually had a huge impact. So so for sharing that.
Of course. Well, it's always nice when you get to see the seeds you've planted, but you might not have watered and watched them grow, but they're growing. And now we're here and we're building this whole program around a conversation that, by the way, when I thought about launching this also in the middle of a pandemic and in the middle of a time of which people are dying in mass quantities around the world. And we're talking about death in sometimes such a heartless way where people are just numbers and we're not really focusing on real lives being lost, but also the ultimate fear that we have at this time
with the anxiety. So it felt like I was scared of launching at this time, but I actually, again, took a lot of solace from your work and the work of your colleagues, I think, in what you're creating, which was, I'm going to speak this truth as much as scary as it is, and I'm going to help share an experience that I hope will inspire other people just to continue to talk about the hard stuff. Because right now it feels like all hard stuff in a lot of, spaces in our life. But I was fascinated as I was doing, I've obviously like Google stalked the heck out of you, and I read your work and I'm following what you're creating in the world. But I was curious, and I asked this of a lot of guests on the program, if we could start way back machine and talk about your birth and what you know about your birth story and what that experience was like for your mom. Like, do you know anything about how you were born and how that process was?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I wasn't supposed to be here for a variety of reasons. For one,
Really?
yeah, I mean, from a rational perspective, wasn't supposed to be here. Obviously, for some other reason, here. But my father was 72 when I was born.
Wow.
Yeah, he was born in 1904 in the Yukon Territory during the gold rush. So, and it's not very common for 72-year-olds to be making babies for a variety. So that the deck was stacked against me a little bit there. My mother was 43.
Wow.
She was told after she had my brother 3 years before that she would never have another child because there was just some complication. I can't remember the details, but she was definitely not expected to get pregnant again or to go to term. Which
Wow.
she did. And so I happened anyway, against great odds, and was born via a C-section. And I mean, I think that it was a strange time to be born. The 70s are not the. I think it's the peak of forgetting how to birth, right? And also the peak of forgetting to some extent how to cook and how to farm. A lot of things we've forgotten. We forgot. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, tell me about the forgetting how to birth. What do you mean by that?
We medicalized
Yes.
over-medicalized childbirth. We've obviously over-medicalized death. We over-industrialized food.
Yeah.
And those processes are I think of them as a forgetting.
Yeah,
And
I
that
see.
we have an opportunity to remember, and we've just really started remembering how to die. And that is a community act, not a medical act. But
Yeah.
I was born in this kind of, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were a pretty rough time for babies and moms, and breastfeeding was thought to be an unnecessary nuisance.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
and I think it impacted my relationship with my mom. We still
Mhm.
struggle around feeling connected.
Mhm.
I wasn't
Yeah.
breastfed and felt really much more nurtured by my father.
Hmm.
Anyways, and then he
That's
was diagnosed.
incredible.
Yeah, but then he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was in second grade. So
Wow.
some
And then how many years after that before he passed? How old were you?
I was 13 when he died.
Wow.
And those were terrible years.
Yeah. Was he your first loss as a child? Your first death that you can remember?
Um, Actually, no. My first death was a cat that I had
Mhm.
named Tiger, and I literally watched Tiger get run over.
Oh my God. How old were you?
I was in sixth grade, and no, fifth grade. Fifth grade when Tiger was run over, and that was and then I had you know. Picked him up off the street and buried him, and I mean, that was
Yeah.
it was rough. And then one of my best friends died the next year in a skiing accident. It was this
Wow.
extraordinary, heroic young downhill ski friend of mine. So we were racers. We competed. We
Oh,
lived in
wow.
Central Oregon. We competed downhill, downhill skiing. But and he was the most magnificent young skier on the mountain. And he, the stupidity and bravery that he showed, but nonetheless, he ended up running, taking this blind cornice and ran directly into a snowplow,
Wow.
and died the year before my father died.
So
Yes.
those were two deaths leading up to the death of your dad. And in your life at that time, in your early years, like how did your family talk about death or address death? Or was it even, when you pick up Tiger after seeing that horrific accident, like, was there a conversation about that for you at home? Or a lot of people are pretty hush hush about it?
Yeah. I mean, I would answer by naming another podcast, but like terribly. Thanks for asking. Right. um, that was it. By not dealing with it all, we didn't
Right.
talk. My father was sick, that he was going to be clear on certain days, and lost in dementia on certain days, and that this was an opportunity to really spend meaningful time with him. The whole thing became, and that he was going to die soon. None of those things were discussed.
Mhm.
So his illness and his impending death, and then his death, turned into a shameful thing,
Yeah.
and that literally ended up being an explosion at the center of our family, like kind of a slow
Mm.
motion H bomb, right? That like completely destroyed the family structure it's still not intact.
Yeah.
Extended family, etc. So that was a very hard thing to watch as a child, and to be not just watch. I say watch, which
Sure.
my therapist would say, like, um, tell
Yeah.
us why
While you were watching. But
you're
that's tremendously traumatic to have happen at that age. And I think that's the other intersection piece. I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like the way that we've thought about, talked about, engaged with death, at least maybe I'll speak from my experience, has been so traumatic in that it's been so silenced or it's been so dismissed. So the denial of the reality of something that happens to everybody, and then also the denial of the reality of how deeply you may feel about things and you may not feel about things. Like there's also this prescribed way I think we've been taught to think about death and mourn and grieve and prepare for it. And again, what I have found in your work and the conversations that have erupted from dinner parties have been um, a lot of different ways to experience this. But at the core of it, a lot of what I've felt in common with people has been the trauma of not um, having it properly contextualized in what we're doing here.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people when I'm hosting a death dinner, or, and sometimes I do like them with 300 people and they're at different tables, right? But they,
Hmm.
um, in a large hall or something. And it's to let them know at the end of the dinner that, how beautiful they are. Um, like literally they look beautiful, right? Because
Hmm.
the thing is, what happens when we talk about death is we reveal that what is most human to ourselves and to the people that we're with. If it's done, in a thoughtful way, in an intentional way,
Yeah.
obviously not all these models, but it just so happens that what is most human about us is what's most beautiful about us, which is great, right? It would be awful if we revealed ourselves and it was horrific. But it just so happens that the more vulnerable we are, the more beautiful we are, um, and the more seen we are, and the more understood. And so, that reversing that massive repression
Hmm.
that we've been able to, that we've been told, don't ask those type of questions as a kid, for the deaf,
Right.
curious children ask, right? Like, signaled and expressly told.
Yeah.
So it is pretty humbling and pretty amazing to be able to be present to people doing this work for the first time or the 100th or 1000th time, right?
I was going to ask you what it feels like for you as you do many parties or as you've done. Do you find that you get emotionally fatigued by them in certain moments of your life? Do you find that they continuously teach you? Like, is there ever a time where you just, I don't know. I almost wanted to say like not dread them because I know there's a purpose there, but I'm just wondering if at any point the constant discovery and peeling back, because what you're talking about too is this ripping away of all the layers we've put on to be vulnerable. The stuff that we're most terrified of talking about is why I think these dinners are so powerful. It's the thing we're running from and hiding from and eating over, gambling over, succeeding over, like all this stuff. And sometimes to face that is exhausting, I find.
Yeah. So, and I learned a trick, um, to make it so that it was, always regenerative. And for the listeners that aren't aware,
Mhm.
a death dinner is death over dinner is, this movement where people use, prompts to talk about, their end of life wishes, etc. So I've been at thousands of dinners, personally, but there's been over 1 million people who've sat down and hosted and been at a death dinner since we started. But for me, what I realized is, if I wasn't, um, moving into terrain, that I was scared of, if I wasn't saying something, that gave me pause, right? So there's a line. When you say be vulnerable, people are like, what does that even mean, right? Like,
Mhm.
some people actually don't know the mechanism for vulnerability, right? And I say this to people often when we host dinners, is like, vulnerability means that you think of something you want to say, and then you think of the reasons why you shouldn't say it, and then you
Right.
say it, right? So there's some fear that you're going to be seen in a particular way. You might get too emotional. You might feel too exposed. Someone might not like you, if you say it. This thing that actually starts arising in you, right? So, as long as I'm crossing those lines, and it's hard. You were like, before we started this, like, if we get into terrain, um,
Mhm.
personal or two, it's like, well, that would be kind of hard, because I always am looking at where that edge is, because I have to cross it all of the
Mm.
time, because it gives permission. And where are you located? Are you in the Midwest? I
I'm
can't
in Los
remember.
Angeles. No, but I spent a lot of time in the Midwest in the early part of my career. Yeah.
For some reason I had an association there, but, when I'm in the Midwest doing dinners, I have to tell people, don't be vulnerable for yourself.
Mm.
As a lot of people have a hard time in the Midwest, like, doing things for themselves. They're very good at doing things for other people.
Mhm.
And so I say very clearly, like, be vulnerable for another person at your table, because it'll give them permission to say something that they need to say. Uh,
Yes.
and that works with, with a good Midwest, personality. They get it
Yeah.
immediately. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I said what I said in the beginning as well, because I'm finding when we first started, I think we've interviewed maybe about almost 20 different people so far. And I've been, kind of on this journey first to discover like, what are these conversations going to be? Because for me, unlike for you, I'm coming from a field, let's say, in a area of work that's been about social systems and lack of representation and lack of seeing people, right? And I've been focused a lot on the physical parts of that. My work has revolved around changing and making campaigns that open up the way people can be seen, but on a physical level. But what I have not been as true to in my own life publicly in my work has been what goes on for me personally, which is I, much like you, also like to dig in and go to those places and beyond, but I've not ever integrated them into my work as much, right? I'm a consultant for large organizations. I do a lot of systems rebuilding for others. But for me, I've had a complete system breakdown the last couple of years as a person, right? I'm reevaluating everything in my life. Part of it is middle passage, I think, in the age and stage where I'm at in my life. I think a lot of it is these losses and just the coming back together of who I am. And so I cherish these kinds of conversations that hold a space in a way that we don't often see held, which is why I like the concept of intimate dinner parties, where I think, you talked about the dinner table as a place where we can have those conversations. But when I've done these interviews, the reason I even said that as a disclaimer was because even though people agree to come on the show and they know what the title is and they know that we're going to talk about it, like walls inevitably come up, right? And there's just spaces that haven't been touched into. And the reason why I said I was so excited to talk with you about this was because I could tell there might be permission almost in a way to kind of invite other people to think about this differently and to not be as afraid of of just digging in a lot deeper than we get to, I think, in our lives. So, this is why for me, I do these and I get really lit up at the end of these conversations, even when I've talked to people who are actively in mourning or, I had to put my cat to sleep this week and I had never done that before as an adult. I've never had to make those decisions before. And I've been in really deep mourning this week while having these conversations and just noticing where I kind of come in and come out of what I'm allowed to feel around death and around loss. And so I'm excited to create new areas for acceptance in these kinds of expressions.
Yeah, I mean, the suffering is in the resistance, and that doesn't mean that the pain goes away, right? But the
Right.
suffering quality around death is in resisting the conversation. I mean, the what I hold strongly and what really is central to not only Death Over Dinner, but the new project we're building, the End of Life Collective,
Mhm.
is this idea that facing our mortality, facing the big D, death, is actually the quickest route to vitality.
Mm.
It's the strongest medicine around vitality, around human connection, around priority setting and meaning.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yep.
but so that's, and it is also, one of the greatest routes to increase our capacity for love. Um,
Agreed.
so we don't, that's not how it's branded.
Definitely not.
You know?
No. It needs a big rebrand, which you're doing, which you're bringing into that. When you think about, we go back to the earlier developmental part of your life, you talked about that death of your dad and the requisite sort of explosion, implosion in the family system as a result of that. When do you think you started? Was that the moment that you started? Did you think about these things around death and loss and the relationship to everything you just mentioned at that age? Did it hit you at another time? Like, I'm curious when the idea or seed gets planted for you that this is a path that you want to really develop and go down.
Yeah, no, I mean, what those early losses did for me was other me. um, and not in a I'm a white man in the United States, or as a white kid in the United States. It didn't other me in the way that that we think of it necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but it made me feel like I was living a very different life than my peers.
Mm,
Interrupted my relationship to my peers, and my sense that everything, the herd mentality of everything was just okay. And I should forget a 13-year-old and, be excited about popularity and sports and
yeah.
things that had value. And all of a sudden there was a rift between me. I remember my father died on Halloween. And I woke up the moment he died, even though he was 20 minutes drive from me. So
Wow.
the moment that he was, it's on his death certificate, I found out later, was the moment I woke up. But I ended up going out that night with friends on Halloween because I didn't tell any of them that my father had died.
Wow.
I didn't know if any of them could hold the weight, right? And so you don't want to hand a weight to somebody you don't think can hold it, right? It's bad design.
Yeah.
And so, but in doing that, I felt myself separate from them. And then I started to ask a lot of questions. And that's kind of where my spiritual investigation began. And I got very interested in Buddhism, and Eastern religion and philosophy and transcendental meditation, and lived a kind of ascetic life during high school. And not even kind of, like, I lived an ascetic life for most of high school. And
Wow.
that definitely sent me in a trajectory.
Right.
And later on, much later on, after I'd been gathering global leaders and Nobel Prize winners and extraordinary artists and musicians at dinner tables for the last for 20 years, where bringing thought leaders together was actually my art form or my craft. And working to enact change table by table and topic by topic. It then occurred to me that it was time to take what I've learned from doing that, from creating transformative conversations at a particular level in culture, and share it with everybody. That's where the pilot for Death Over Dinner was formed, from the idea of scaling the dinner table and scaling transformative conversation. I was torn between having a conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict
Okay.
or death.
Or
Those,
death.
yeah,
Super light topics.
totally. The good stuff doesn't come from
Really. Super fluff. That's incredible. So then what made you go to death and not Israeli Palestine?
I didn't think that I start to envision people going at each other with forks and knives.
Fair.
Some of the most rational aren't rational around that topic. And so it's divisive. People have opinions and they're quote unquote experts.
Yeah.
Beauty of death is there are no experts.
No, but it's interesting as you talk about the othering that happened from a really significant loss in your life at a time. And I love that you described it, or it resonated for me that you described it, of not kind of sharing it with people who might not be able to bear the weight of that. I think the other similarity that I share, outside of also being a child of the 70s, where my mom was on gas when I was born. So I remember that being part of the birth story. It was natural, but there was gas, so not so natural. But I remember, so I was 13 when I had my first significant loss, and it was the boy that I first loved, and he was murdered by his mom. And I was in 8th grade, and his dad was a high profile politician. I grew up in Florida. His dad was a high profile politician. It was election eve. She was getting ready to lose him in a custody battle. She murdered her son and then she killed herself. So it was this incredibly public story. And I had just fallen in love with him that summer. He was a couple years older than I was. He was like everything perfectly that I had ever wanted in a romance. And I was a very romantic little girl. Like those sorts of ideas and fairy tales was where I lived. And then he was gone, and gone in such a big way. So 2 things were formative for me there that I also find important in the work that you're doing. One was when my parents told me about it, they were incredibly ill-equipped to handle the depth. So my parents were not able to bear the weight of what was happening, and they sent me to school that day. So I sat in the hallway in between lockers, just hysterically crying all day, because I had never experienced a loss this big, plus this graphic and violent, and I had no concept of where to kind of put the pieces back together. So grieving has been this journey for me to understand, like, all of the ways that grief stays in your body, and that unexpressed grief for me formed a lot of ways that I had relationships, the way I protected myself against loving deeply for that fear of loss and that loss so violently. And then the other part was in grieving was that he had a private funeral. So I didn't have the ritual of saying goodbye. And that age, I didn't know what to ask for. And I didn't know, how to express what I needed or that I even needed it. But I created a ritual where I talked to him in the corner of my room. I've actually never shared this really publicly before, but I almost created like an altar for him where I was able to have a relationship with him in this other form, right? To close and converse with this person that I was having such strong feelings for. And I think so for me, I think also in this work, what resonates is creating a space where where you're holding the space for all of this emotion to be without, you might be afraid of it. It might be overwhelming. People might feel that, but there's still the permission to be there. But the other is the ritual of it, the ritual of the dinner, of the way we make the dinner, of the way we organize the conversation. That ritual was really important and is still important for me in how I learn to grieve, not just physical death loss, but loss of things in my life all the time, identities, relationships. Like, we're losing things constantly. And that's an area that I want to explore more with people. How do we become okay with goodbyes and hellos?
Yeah, the little deaths.
The little deaths.
I mean, we're a culture that's obsessed with this idea of transformation, and that's, we actually misunderstand transformation. We do want transformation, but we miscategorize it as change,
Yeah.
growth, or a state change, right? Like, I'm going to go to CrossFit, or I'm going to go to meditation, and I'll quiet my mind. And but what we're really thirsting for is a transformed state, not just a state change. But we want a palpable change in the way that we experience ourselves or the world, right?
Yeah.
That kind of growth. But what that comes from is death, right? So transformation, the difference between transformation and growth is death. Right. So that it knows this, like, it transforms itself every year,
Right.
because it dies every year. Right.
Right.
That there, we have to, practicing dying, and is an essential part of so many cultures. Right. Rites of passages, people, like, we hold up a marriage, you know, ritual as this new growth, but it's, this new self. It's also, your single self is dying, right?
Yes.
As much a death ritual as it is a birth ritual, right?
Yes.
If you don't kill off the single self, this is probably why our divorce rate is where it is, right? Because we aren't honoring it as both things.
Yeah.
Is the single self that is maintained into a married union that will ultimately kill off that union,
Right.
right? And so, how can we get good at the small deaths, the easier deaths?
Right.
Uh,
And that, I mean, I think that's exactly part of what this program will bleed itself into, is a community that I want to convene around talking about what it means to live a good life, right? So on your own terms, what does that actually mean? And that sort of, I think, involves having the conversations we're having, and it also involves early conversations around end of life and around what that means. I think even on my own team here, I think the first hurdle I had in wanting to talk about death from the world I was coming from was like, oh man, what a bummer. Like, that's going to be so, you're so down all the time, which is why I even said, like, no, it's going to be a joyful podcast, because actually at the end of the day, this does bring me joy. It brings me joy to connect, to meet somebody that I admire and respect, but also to have conversations with people that, I feel like is a gift to be able to go there with people and to understand. That's why I start with the birth story, or because so many people have incredible metaphors of how and when they were born and stories of what that means in their whole life. But anyway, it was kind of getting over the stigma, I think, of like, wow, it's going to be such a bummer to talk about this. But how do you know what you want to be living for and creating all of this urgent energy in your life and this connected, directed kind of work and being if you don't acknowledge that it ends?
yeah. Well, I mean, there's the two things that come up. One is that we'd like to say that death is taboo, or the last great taboo. It's a moving target with whatever the last great taboo is, but it's obviously attached to death often. And what I like to remind people is that, and or just even teach some people because they don't know this, and I didn't know it until a few years ago. But taboo doesn't mean forbidden. That's not the root of the word. It comes from a Polynesian word, tapu, T-A-P-U, and what it was used for is a sacred or holy place. A place is tapu, burial ground, right? And the idea is it's not forbidden, it just requires you to be in a certain state of mind. It requires preparation, it requires it's different from the profane realm, right? And so it's, when people are like, we don't want death to be taboo, it's like, no, death is taboo. And
Right.
that doesn't mean you're not invited in. It doesn't mean it's forbidden. It means that you just need to, like you said, prepare the proper container.
Right.
And that's why we created Death Over Dinner, was with the idea that we need an easy, blamable third party, an easy set of guidelines. So you don't have to think, because ritual's awkward. It's weird. We're not used to it. If we're not used to it, if we are used to it, we're probably a bit ideological about the rituals that we. And they get more powerful the more that we do them, or the more they're used culturally. And so that's some, because we've been talking about rituals, we've been talking about it being a forbidden topic, but the story that comes to mind around people being resistant to this conversation. So we started working with Cleveland Clinic, which is one of the most extraordinary healthcare organizations on the planet. And they decided that they wanted to build the healthcare edition of Death Over Dinner with us. And we built it and we've launched it, and there's clinicians all over the world that are now taking part in it. But doctors, especially surgeons, are very resistant in most cases to this conversation. And we found that especially heart surgeons. And Cleveland Clinic is where the first heart transplant was successfully performed. And the chief anesthesiologist from the cardiothoracic department, the heart surgery department, came to a death dinner because someone begged him, pulled him in. He literally came with the idea that I'm coming so that I can have this experience, so that I can once and for all tell the board of governors that this is a terrible. That's totally and just looked at me like, who is this guy? What are we doing? I can't wait to tear him apart. Then tears, crying, broke open. Like a month later, he's convened all of the heart surgeons, all of their physician assistants, their nursings. I've got the full cardiothoracic department at a death dinner because he had such, they all knew the story, skeptic, and they were skeptics. So now I've got 50 skeptics in the room. And I told him, I was like, listen, you practice medicine, right? And to you, medicine means staving off death. And I was like, tonight, I'm going to ask you, even though I don't have extra letters in front of or after my name, and there's no real reason that you should take my word for it, but I'm going to ask you that tonight we just suspend that notion, and I want you to believe that death is actually the medicine. That talking about it, in fact, is in itself medicine. And they just you could hear the breath go out of the. And it wasn't something that I'd thought of that I was going to say. And literally table after table of these surgeons and anesthesiologists breaking open, and you literally watched. I knew that there would be a shift in the culture in the ICUs with a different way of having conversations with the patients and with the family. Because if we aren't comfortable with this as clinicians or as leaders, or as, anyone, really, how would anybody be comfortable talking to us?
Right.
So there's a lot of unlearning.
That's incredible. When we talk about the unlearning of all the ways that death has been packaged for us, I think obviously of religion at sort of the forefront of how many people form their ideas of death and where you go when you die, and the binary thinkings and a lot of those religious ideologies. I also think about, obviously, I love that you unpacked taboo and talked about it not being forbidden, it being more about getting into the right mindset in order to explore. I too, in this transformative period of my life, am drawn to Buddhist teachings in a way I have not before, mostly because what I'm taking from it is to bring the pain towards me and to not run from that, which I think is, we're really great at hustling away from everything that matters to us in this world. But I'm curious, as you educate scientists and medical leaders and political leaders and folks that ultimately impact large systems or can impact large systems, what's the greatest pieces of unlearning you're having to help them with? Is it all of those things we mentioned? Are there other things we're not thinking about that create this barrier for looking at death, as you said, as sort of a great medicine for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're trained to repress our emotions, in different ways. You know, we're both told, girls are told that they're too much, boys are told that they're too much. Everyone's kind of,
Mhm.
your authentic self is too much.
Right.
Um, and the what we don't have are a lot of tools for like creating a muscle of that reverses repression, right? Obviously therapy is that. It's a very, very powerful tool for
Mhm.
reversing repression and getting to authentic expression and the healing. As you start doing that, all
Mhm.
of these things come up, right?
Yeah.
Love in a relationship, and we have to deal with another human, and ourselves in that. You know,
Mhm.
that's a this dyad that does that. But in a group setting, we have very few models, unless you're part of AA or unless you're
Mhm.
part of Al-Anon or different group settings. We don't have a lot of group models for healing, and for sharing. Uh,
Mhm.
there's something um, almost more powerful, I think, about doing that healing, growing, exposing, seeing yourself within a group of stakeholders in your life instead of like, I went to Esalen and
Mhm.
I am a new person. And then I come back, or I went to, and I did Landmark Forum, and
Right.
I went to, X, whatever transformative
Right.
experience. I had an ayahuasca ceremony. With a bunch of strangers. We tend to do our primary amount of growth amongst a paid professional like a therapist or a bunch of people we may never see again.
Right.
And then sometimes we're like, now, I mean, you watch people do this. They then join the community of where they got that transformation,
Right.
and their friends say they're in a cult. Um,
Right.
like sometimes they are,
Yeah.
but that's really because people want to change and grow and transform with their loved ones,
Right.
with friends, and we need to be able to give lots of different models and permissions for that. Death Over Dinner does it. uh,
Yeah.
Changes it can change family dynamics in one dinner. I've seen it, like,
Yeah.
really shift a family dynamic. You have to keep tending that garden, like,
Yes.
one and done, but a crack in the door that then you can continue to open is pretty.
Yeah. I I relate to so much of this when I decided to do our death. So when Myra died, she died January 4th, 2018. every October I go away with my husband and a really good group of couples, and we have like this like luxurious time together. It's kind of our time to forget about the world. But that year I wanted to remember everybody that we had lost. I wanted to create our own death dinner party. And I remember asking for that for my birthday. And even my dearest friends and people that I know love me and would literally bury a body for me, right? Like, were just like, you gotta fucking be kidding me. Really? Like, I want to have, so talking about even a community dynamic shift within our friends to say, but what was so to say, like, yes, I want to go here. And I knew everybody in my circle had significant losses, right? And we talked about them only at the moment of impact, only when those parents died or their dogs died, but we didn't continue talking about what the ripple effect was in their life. And so my husband surprised me by building, because we were actually married also on the Day of the Dead in Mexico. So I also feel very, and my birthday is Halloween and I'm a Scorpio. So I feel like I'm actually super built to have this in my life. But I remember like my friends, when I came downstairs, they had lit the altar. They had all brought pictures of their person that they wanted to talk about. And we did it, slightly a little bit off script, but it was something that I will never, ever forget, broke open even very, very deep friendships that I had, places that I already felt like we knew everything. We had never talked about death in this way before. And it wasn't just about reliving the past. I think sometimes people don't want to talk about death because they don't want to feel the pain of the loss or relive the loss, but this was something different because they were couples. We talked about, how do we want to die? Like, we actually went into I think rather than what they thought would be this sort of like trip down memory lane, became, what is your ideal death? What is your perfect death? What would, what would you want to see happen? And these were things they were more terrified to talk about than anything. And I've sat and held their hands as they came out to their families when we were in college, and, been to funerals for their family members. And this was the most scariest thing to talk about, was to actually try to imagine what you want as you wind down your life, or what you want, if you're even able to talk about what you would like to experience at the end of your life.
Yeah, I mean, it's the hardest in some ways, and I mean, and it just has the most gold, right? I mean, our gifts are in our wounds.
For
Some
sure.
I learned very clearly from a mythologist and teacher, Michael Mead, that I used to
Mhm.
very closely, and that's a we can get really mad at that structurally, that our gifts are in
Yeah.
our, right, but it doesn't change that. But we still, it seems pretty irrefutable.
Yeah.
If you want to know why you're here, if you want to know what your quote unquote destiny is, like, a lot of people haven't had that feeling of, I know why I'm here, and that makes me really sad. But that clarity comes from going into your pain.
Right.
It comes from going into the things you're afraid of.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people think they're here to accomplish things. When I talk to people about, why do you think why you're here? They often will talk to me about a business goal or a creative goal. That becomes like the marker of their life well lived.
Sure, what you want to get, what you want to achieve, but how do you want to feel? Like,
Right.
you want to feel like you're actually living out your life's purpose, and your life
Right.
has that kind of resonant meaning. You talk to people, like, they have a felt sense. People have a felt sense of that missing, um, you
Yep.
know, part of our fabric. So it's not. It's just that, many people aren't given the tools or the incentivized.
Mm-hmm.
Culture certainly doesn't incentivize that type of introspection.
Mm-mm.
It doesn't reward it. So
Do you find as you have done this work in your life, how has this impacted the relationships that you create? And you have two children, right? You have two daughters, is that right? How does it bleed into and live into the relationships that you create in your life? Knowing what you know, doing the work that you do, what do you think that feels like in your relationships?
yeah, well, I mean, I didn't have too much of a problem with toxic people, or like you mentioned, or
Mm.
still some, or surface-based relationships, but it will quickly clean that out.
Mm-hmm.
This work does that. I mean, um, to not get too attached to our ideas of things, right? Like, take my daughters. Um, I had to. I've learned very clearly that they're raising me, right, as an adult, and so that the idea, or like raising a teenager, that we've created a war on teenagers
Yes, we have.
because you know, because we don't like what they're reflecting to us, right? They're Teenagers are scared that they're going to become us.
That's
Right?
right.
They're angry about it, and they want to tell us where we're out of integrity, and we don't like hearing that. And so we've wholesale said that teenagers are insane, like the teenager brain. And
Yeah.
sure, there's some science around what's going on in their brain, but the war that we've waged is about not wanting the reflection.
That's right. And developmentally, they're at an age where they're supposed to be separating from us.
Yeah.
And so we don't, and most adults, parents don't like that. They want to continue to own a child as a reflection of who they are.
Sure. Well, and they better behave in a way that makes you look good.
That's right.
And so that's, that this work, I think, had softened me up. So when my daughter, my oldest daughter, was in crisis in her life, that I just got into crisis with her.
Yeah. When you are embarking now on the end of life collective that you're creating and bringing out this conversation more with people, it's probably the biggest theme. Maybe it is the age and stage I'm at in middle age in my life, and talking to couples, even team members that I have here have mentioned that they're starting to have different conversations with their partners about these things. I know, quite honestly, even this week, my husband, who's been along for this ride and journey with me in such a beautiful way, when I had to and chose to end my cat's life and her suffering from this cancer that she was having, it brought up all these conversations for us about what is quality of life. You have these conversations with folks about quality over quantity, but it's an assumption of what do we think quality is. And we've been married 7 years, and so we are and I got married later in life, and so all of a sudden it becomes this reality. We don't have children, so it talks about, like, we talk about what do we want to be, and communication is really important to me. So I know that I don't want to be a vegetable. I know not being able to communicate in many ways is not going to be something I would want to be a vessel to be kept alive. We started talking about those things, and he works with his hands, he builds furniture. And so we were talking about the things that matter to us. And, we feel totally lost in doing that. We don't know what's quote unquote right or wrong, or what are we supposed to be valuing. We have all this old embedded family, systems, and he's from Mexico. So his family never talked about death. They were in this, like, it would only, it happened and they sort of mourned and then it went away and nobody talked about it. And my family is Jewish. So, like, we have all these sorts of other rituals, but the real conversations have never really emerged for me. And so I find, as two adults, we're talking about reality of how we want to plan end of life, and how we'd ideally, if we have a chance, we'd want to die. But we don't know how to do that, right? We don't have a sense of how to do that. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you view those conversations within couples and communities around end of life planning, and just even beginning to think about those things.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the good thing is there's some great projects, like the Conversation Project, and there's
Mhm.
death cafes to some extent. There's the beginning of a real change. But what is missing is that in order to think about your options and create a great plan, or be creative, or just even be literate and empowered about how you plan for the last chapter, you have to become pretty expert. And you also have to go to a lot of different places,
Yeah.
and you have no filter of knowing if you're getting good information, or et cetera. And so, I mean, that's why, we built this thing, the End of Life Collective, which we're just calling EOL, with the idea that needs to, and it launches in July. But with the idea that it needs to be so easy It needs to be as easy as your iPhone or as an iPad, as intuitive that you can go to the site and take care of everything, and you know that you're getting, the best content and practitioners and service providers, right? Like Apple did that for us.
Mm-hmm.
Like a 6-year-old can pick up an iPad without an instruction manual, and they can find the shows that they want or the content they want or the games they want, right? And it's gonna. So that's how we've been thinking about it. Let's make it so beautiful, inspiring, easy, and like such an adventure and a journey, or just like utilitarian and in and out, and you get it done. That's what we've been working to build, and
Amazing.
been able to connect with all of, or many of it's more every day, but already like 300 of the leading end-of-life organizations and service providers in the country, and every single one has been like, yes, please connect us, right? Because that continuum from legal, estate planning,
Yes.
insurance,
Yep.
assisted care, hospice, palliative, bereavement, memorials, funerals, grief, that's not connected anywhere.
Mm-mm.
All very connected in a continuum, but nowhere you can go for all of that. And so it's been it's a massive amount of work.
I bet.
Yeah, and we have a
bet.
massive team, and it's very exciting. So
Yeah.
that process of connecting medical directors to funeral directors, right? Why is that extraordinary?
Right.
But if it's groundbreaking to see that, because they don't talk, right? Like as if they're on completely different planets, but they are definitely on the same planet.
Right.
And
why do you think they haven't before? Have these industries formed so independently around how they create resource for themselves? About like what do you think has been the barrier as to why there hasn't been this connection?
Yeah, I mean, over compartmentalization, over medicalization, death became a bad word in the medical space. The funeral world got a bad reputation for a long time that we're still recovering from. So it's just there's a lot of reasons, and technology is just now getting to the point where it's actually cheap and available enough to do something that's enough of a value add to these different categories together.
Yeah. I was talking to a woman yesterday on this program who lost her husband at 44 to pancreatic cancer. And she talked about the most painful part of that process. She lost him very quickly, but the most painful part of that process was actually what happened after he died, was knowing what to do and where to go and the things that they hadn't planned, the passwords that they hadn't shared with each other, just all of the planning that she needed to have had to know what to do. And she's left with 4 children. And she talked about that pain in that moment feeling more acute than the pain of the loss, was feeling even more lost that they had never talked about. And they were, and they were a young couple, and that was their reason why, in a way, which I'm sure you've probably heard a lot of folks delaying these kinds of conversations. How do we talk about this more fluidly and more freely to get people thinking about this, even talking to their children differently about it? What do you think we need to do in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to do what we're doing, which is we need to change the story.
Mm.
We need to change the meta narrative. And I'm part of the Global Wellness Institute's Dying Well initiative. The Global Wellness Institute has identified, that dying well is a wellness trend, a global wellness trend, and has a working group working on it. Right, like we're hosting a death dinner in a couple of weeks together for the Wellness Institute. So what needs to happen is it needs to cross into these places like the medical field. What we need to do is get AARP to start talking about death, not just like awesome RV trips and where you're going to go fishing, but like these institutions that are actually taking care of us at the end need to start having these conversations about end of life, I believe, and death, and feel comfortable about it in themselves.
Yes.
So yeah, that meta narrative, the mythic story about this needs to change in our culture.
Yeah.
And then we'll see. We don't even know what the future looks like for it. It's not even death positive. I don't like that idea of death positive or good death. Those feel like they could be make somebody feel like they're not doing it right.
Yeah.
I'm not asking people to be happy about losing somebody.
Right.
Ridiculous to me. So yeah,
What's your take on language as well? The meta narrative is important. What is your take on language when people say they transitioned, they passed away? Do you prefer words like dying, they died versus they passed away? I've heard some people who've experienced loss have different points of view on language, but I also think language is a key way in which we communicate and change that narrative. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how we talk about it, what words we use.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with an individual deciding that they're more comfortable saying using words like passing away, and like what I think is important is at a leadership level that the word death not be euphemized, and and because then that does signal, it gives people permission to use um, more factual, more authentic language if they want to. Because even if those of us that are comfortable, we end up feeling like we're being rude by saying he died instead of he
Right.
passed away or she passed away, and that's ridiculous. But that's a
Yep.
so I'd like to hold leaders and organizations to that standard and let people do what they want to do.
Yeah. You know what I'm also drawn to, and where we can change and have an opportunity to change is not just in, I mean, it's important in the AARP and the places where we're talking about aging individuals, but when we go back to talking about teenagers, another really formidable experience in my life was I was at Columbine after the shootings in 1999, and I worked with the students who had lived through that massacre. And I remember an incident explicitly where I got, 800 teenagers dropped into an auditorium for me to sort of talk through. And I ran a theater company at the time. So I used plays as a way to kind of open up the dialogue. And we totally bombed because we weren't really hitting their emotional narrative and what had really happened, right? We had kind of built this play separate from what is happening. But I remember a young girl stood up and she just said, I want to talk about what happened. Because all the adults had left the room. They dropped the kids in, they left, right? The school just sort of was overwhelmed with the trauma and all the stuff that was happening. And she said, I want to talk about that my best friend died and I didn't. My best friend didn't pass away. I sat next to her when she was murdered, and nobody's talking to me about the reality of what I experienced. That was in 1999, when I was certain that we would never have another school shooting like that again. And so I think the other part of this conversation that I'm interested in as you build these communities to talk about these things are young people who've seen more of their friends die in different ways than we could ever possibly imagine. And the threat of death and dying is so real to them in a way that, at least when I was a kid, even though I had that tragedy of Bobby being murdered at 13, I didn't worry about somebody coming and shooting up my school as well. It was a tragic experience, and I still lived a relatively safe school life where I didn't think about those things. And I think about young people now who've had to publicly mourn and grieve. I mean, the Columbine kids were so different from the kids, let's say at Parkland, in this most recent shooting, because we didn't have social media at the level we had in 1999. And so their grieving was still somewhat private, somewhat hush hush. It was a very religious community, Littleton, Colorado. So there was a different ethos in the air about how they could talk about those deaths. And then I watched the Parkland kids, and when that massacre happened, immediately go to camera and demand that adults specifically face the tragedy of what they were feeling and not make euphemisms over it and not, push it away. And so I actually think there might be a great allyship in our young people who, unfortunately, by a lot of failures for us as adults in politics and government, have created a world in which talking about death for them comes way sooner, perhaps, than we had as children, or in a different way. I mean, I think death has always been there, but it's become part of their narrative and their growing up narrative. I don't know if you've seen that. I don't know how old your daughters are, but this generation is primed, I think, to be great advocates for the community that you're creating. because they've been denied access to this conversation publicly.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, I was just in a session with Pacific Lutheran University where they're building the university edition of Death Over Dinner.
That's great.
And watching the students grapple with that. And I mean, at the way I land with when it comes to kids, because some kids do, even though they live in a world that has different or more threats, some of them it doesn't pierce into
That's true.
childhood, and some are curious, right?
Mm.
So people are like, should there be kids at death dinners or involved in these conversations, etc.? And it's always like, if they want to be, if they're asking questions, if they have a curiosity, meet them in their curiosity. If they don't, fine. Like at some point there is going to be a realization of their mortality, but not something you want to force on somebody.
No, for sure not. But I love the idea of there being able to have a community experience around it, even if their family may not be equipped to have that conversation, just to know that there's a way to have it, because they grow up to be our parents of tomorrow. And it would be amazing to have those folks armed with the knowledge and the permission, I think, to really engage.
Well, I mean, with COVID, the people say, well, what's different now, with COVID? And I said, well, we're in the middle of the experience. We can't tell you. We can't say how we're going to integrate. But one thing that, I don't think the death conversation has become easier. I think it's become harder.
Yeah.
More prevalent. The only, but it takes even more sensitivity, warmth, presence, because we are more hypervigilant and in more panic right now. But the thing that it has done for us is it has made it completely rational, completely sensible for a family to have a plan. Instead of like you being, hey friends, we need to have this thing, and they're like, she's crazy, but we love her.
Right.
Like if you speak to friends right now, we
100%.
have an end of life plan. Let's all get an end of life plan together.
Yes.
It's not the outlier, the squeaky wheel anymore. It's absolutely a common sense thing to do. And so,
I hadn't thought about that in that way. You're right. That actually has given us a grand opening to legitimize it, perhaps in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah. We should all, it's like as if an earthquake hit the whole country. You say you should have an earthquake preparedness. Right. And they're like, yeah. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. They do in California at time, right?
Right, of course. Yeah. As you embark on this work and continue doing this work, do you find that you change or evolve your views on your end of life plan and the way that you address it personally for yourself?
Yeah, it's the Heraclitus quote or whatever, Heraclitus, that you never step in the same river twice.
Yeah.
And it does, it changes. And so it's a fluid thing about, our values change.
Yes.
Our what we want at the end changes. So yeah, it is have the great honor and opportunity to go back to again and again.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you a couple of last questions, and one actually kind of interesting point as you talk about, because I think like a huge through line in my experience of your work is community, and I think I might have even gotten this story off of your Death Over Dinner Facebook page, which is incredible and a piece of community I highly value. But I'm going to maybe mix up some of the story, but it was a conversation around, or a story around Aboriginal culture in Australia and what happens when in small villages a family member or somebody dies from one house to the other. And I think it was something that was posted in your feed. And the idea was that when a neighbor lost somebody, all of the other neighbors at night took out their furniture from their house and rearranged it on the lawn, so that in the morning when the sun rose and that family stepped outside, the world looked different. And it was a way that their neighbors could acknowledge that they know their world has just changed by their loss.
Yeah.
And I have kept that in my heart like the whole time, as far as like the best analogy I think of what it feels like to be seen when you've lost somebody, and all of the beautiful ways in which community can come together to hold and honor that space. And I think I'm hungry for the continued conversation outside of the moment of loss, this continued conversation as people grieve and grow and change and shift, but that always being able to be seen and normalize all of these deep and rich river of emotions that you have as you consider all of these things, or you experience all of these things. Because I know that there's a lot of energy and effort spent on the moment of loss from somebody, and then there's a lot of additional loss when that energy goes away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, I mean, a part of us dies when someone we love dies, and depending on how entwined we were enmeshed, we were with that person, how much of our
Yeah.
identity was wrapped up into them. It's not taken as seriously. But and one thing that people reflect on is that they feel distance from some of their friends and closer to some of their friends when there's a loss, and a lot of guilt and a lot of conflict around not feeling close to some friends anymore. And you are, with a significant loss, you're a new person, and it's okay to gravitate towards the people that do show up for you.
Mm.
And and it's okay, and they may come back, and I'm not saying get rid of all of your old friends who aren't there, but it's okay to feed into that and to realize that the person, for whatever reasons, that isn't able to be there for you. Maybe there's an unresolved death in their life, or there's
Yeah.
And that I want to make that okay for people, and that, because there's a lot of pain felt around
Yeah.
how do I deal with the new me.
Do you find in the death dinners or in other areas of your conversation that people talk about animals as much as they talk about human beings, or do they mostly focus on human loss?
Not yet, but it's coming. I think that we still haven't given people permission to grieve their pets in the same way that we give people permission to grieve humans. And the losses are often way more meaningful, and have bigger impact in your daily life and your emotional life, etc. But we haven't made that okay, and we're beginning to. But it's funny, as we build EOL, I'm like, pet memorialization and burial is probably going to be the largest growing sector of anything.
Yeah.
We're dealing with 35 different categories of service. And I was like, we really need to pay attention here because it's coming.
Yeah.
And so, and it's true, I mean, I have my two dogs right here. They are as important as, for many of us, as any other sapien happens to be in our life.
That's right. I know. So my CC, it was 9 years old. And literally she's my daughter, right? She's the first animal that I ever had to learn how to nurture and love as an adult, my first, adult pet. And I felt like all this week, I didn't really have the permission to grieve as much as I wanted to, because she was, quote unquote, just a pet. And I will tell you that when I have shared this, and I pushed myself to share this even publicly in my communities about this process, and the response back has been so incredible and so met with equal amounts of remembered grief and loss and love. And, and so it's a different kind of community of conversation around pets, but it's also not. It's the same sort of piece. But to your point, on a practical level, when it came down to like, what do we do with her body and what do I want? The crematorium had like a whole list of things I could do with her ashes afterwards, and all of these ways to turn her ashes into jewelry and this and that. There's industry will always be born, I think, from these, from these losses. But I would have loved to have had a different language or a guide to consider as an owner, right? Like making those decisions, because they're probably not unlike if you were, looking at end of life care for somebody dying in your life? What is going back to like, what is quality and what risk do I take medically? And where do I value the kind of energy and spirit this person was, and knowing that that may not return? Like all of those things were there. And certainly, very lost. And also in the time of COVID too, to be able to get in, to be with her, to see her, I was highly aware that I was able to be with her while she died when human beings were not able to be there with loved ones. So it's a complicated mix. I'm happy to hear that you're thinking about that, because I do think that's an important space. Anyway, it's been a big defining narrative in my life this week, and probably for many, many days to come. I wanted to read you a quote that I loved that you said. Probably this feels weird when people do this to you, but this is this is just something I think it dovetails nicely, and maybe a good way to sort of end our conversation for now. I think it was in another interview that you gave, but you said, if you don't know what you're living for, how are you going to fight for it? That's what death does when you look at it, when you spend time with it, when you look at death in the mirror. It gives you the ability to sharpen your priorities. What it is you want to do with the rest of your days, and who you want to be. And so I'm curious how you would answer that question for yourself right now today as we're talking. What is a legacy you're hoping to leave, and who do you want to be?
Wow. Let's see. Who do I want to be? I'm working all the time on kindness. It's, I don't need to achieve anything else, or I feel pretty good, but yeah, I think that's a pretty rough childhood, and wasn't modeled. There wasn't a lot of kindness modeled in my life, so that's a lot of like focusing a lot of work on how I teach myself as an adult, what that looks like. And just being very honest about the places where I don't feel like I have access to it. So yeah, I would be happy with people saying he was very kind.
The big part of us learning to reparent ourselves from those lacks early on. Well, you're not only kind, you're incredibly impactful, and you have shaped, I think, a new desire in me to be an advocate and ally for these conversations in the way that I can and in my own life. And so for that, I will be eternally grateful and so happy that you said yes to this conversation. And I hope we get to have more of these in the future.
Likewise, we'll have dinner.
Okay. I love that. I'm like, I would love to do that. And thank you. Thank you for the work. I have so many things going through my head after the end of this conversation. One is that I just want more. So hopefully Michael will say yes to coming back again as he launches the End of Life Collective, and we can talk about what that really is becoming in the world. The biggest things that I took away from this conversation were about community. I think a validation that community is just an imperative ingredient for us to continue to deconstruct dying and death and life and living. And we can't do this alone. We shouldn't do this in a vacuum. And it may not always be enough just to do it with like a paid professional, that if we can socialize this as a community and have these conversations in a safe and healthy way, how impactful and important this will be. And then probably on a personal note for me, I appreciated the validation and being seen at the end about grieving the loss of animals. I think, when we talk about facing death and end of life, and we talk about letting go of a loved pet, I appreciated that Michael acknowledged we don't often give ourselves as much permission to grieve the loss of an animal as we might a human. And that animals, for those who are animal lovers and have had important animals in their life, they occupy a really incredible space on a daily basis, in a routine and in a connection that is just different. So I appreciated acknowledging the spectrum of grieving and loss. And that's really why I wanted to have these conversations, because there's so many layers to dig into. We're only just beginning. Thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to We're All Gonna Die Anyway with me, Jess Weiner. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can also watch this podcast by checking out my YouTube channel for filmed episodes, behind the scenes footage, and all other kinds of amazing video goodies. And of course, you can always visit me at jessweiner.com. We're All Gonna Die Anyway is exec produced by me and produced by Lauren Chavez Myers. Our episodes are recorded, filmed, and edited by Jeff Franklin and Adam Lippert of B Film. And our original amazing music is by Becca and Destiny Petrell. As always, I want to send a special thank you to the love of my life, the amor de mi vida, Felipe Lopez. And if you love this podcast, please make sure to tell your friends, subscribe, and leave a review at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, if there is something that stood out to you from today's episode, I want to hear about it. So if you want to share your own story, leave a comment, ask a question, please send me an email at podcast@jesswiener.com. I can't wait to hear from you. Bye, babies.